Welcome to The Cutting Edge with Dr. Lee Pierson and Dr. Robert Stubblefield. I'm Steve Richins, and we have a special guest today, James Ellias. James has a master's degree in physics, and he is daring enough to have new theories, or at least he's on this program where he's trying to establish some ideas, and we're going to be discussing those things. And one note, we all met at OCON, and we confirmed that we're non-androids. We're actually human beings, and that's a fact, right?
Some of us. I'm not sure about all of it. Okay, so
okay. Anyway, over to Lee. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So, what is this? What are these new ideas about? It's about induction, the process of inductive reasoning, which is something like achieving generalizations based ultimately on perceptual evidence. I like to stress the basis in perception. I think that's really important. And we'll get to that probably not so much this week, because what we're going to talk about this week, if I understand it, what James wants to talk about is a kind of, maybe you might say, preliminary issue of the hierarchy of knowledge, how the hierarchy of knowledge, or how hierarchies of knowledge work. I know maybe that's not a preliminary issue, but it's not the full issue by any means. You know, inductive reasoning.
Not the full issue.
Yeah, inductive reasoning, after all, is there's some good work in objectivism. It's been a hot topic at least since David Hume, who, because the idea of induction is, let's say you're looking out at a pond and you see some white swans. Or, you see 5 white swans, and that's all there are. There are no other white swans. There are no other swans. There are 5 white swans in the pond. And you say, aha, the swans, all swans in this pond are white. Well, that is a trivial case of what they call enumerative induction. And that doesn't cause any problems. The problems, if there are any problems, if there really are problems, arise, as David Hume noted, when you try to say, what about swans that I'm not, cases of swans that have not yet been seen, or cases of swans in the future, cases of swans in Australia, where many of them happen to be black. I've seen them myself. What do you do about those sorts of cases? Well, that's where you have to bring in hierarchies of knowledge and causation. That's one way. That's the way some Oxford logicians like H.W.B. Joseph went to try to describe induction in terms of causation. I guess that's an Aristotelian tradition. At roughly the same time, maybe a little later, a crossover in Cambridge University, some of the Cambridge people, such as John Maynard Keynes, started talking about induction in terms of probability, and that's what won the day. The philosophers nowadays all talk about probability. But I think James is going to go back to the more Aristotelian tradition and talk about its connection to causality, and that's where we need to talk about hierarchies of knowledge, because they are arranged somewhat, at least to some degree, in terms of causality. So I'll stop there. We're going to have James talk for a while, and then our first discussant afterwards will be Dr. Stubblefield, who I know has thought about this issue to some depth and has some things to say. And then we'll all jump in after that. How's that, Steve? Is that okay with you? All right. So James, take it away, sir.
So that's actually a great introduction, Lee, because that leads us right into, that is in fact exactly what I view as the relevance of the issue of hierarchy to induction. But before I get into that, I'll just tell the audience what I'm doing. So I'm the founder of the Inductive Physics Project. And the goal of the Inductive Physics Project is first to write a theory of induction. And I'm quite close to finishing that theory of induction and writing that. And hopefully we'll finish it around December. I've been writing that for a few years now. So the first goal of the Inductive Physics Project is to write a theory of induction. Then next, my goal is to use that theory of induction to write a reproof of all of the essential principles of physics which have been discovered so far. And the purpose of this reproof is to identify and differentiate the parts of established physics which are right, that can be shown to follow from evidence, and the parts of known physics which are, well, known physics which are wrong and don't follow from established evidence. And the motivation for this reproof is that we know, especially as objectivists, that parts of modern physics are definitely wrong. To summarize that really quickly, I can say that I simply, straightforwardly agree with the views of David Harriman on this subject. David Harriman points out philosophical flaws in both quantum mechanics and relativity. And to state those briefly, quantum mechanics is flawed because a particle can't be a wave at the same time. And general relativity is flawed because space is not an object that can bend. So that's a very quick summary, but here's the thing. So these theories are flawed, but here's the thing. These theories are also very successful at actually making predictions. So they're not getting everything wrong. They can't simply be thrown out entirely. So in my view, only an inductive reproof of everything that led to these theories will allow us to actually extract the good parts from the bad parts of these theories. And of course, the only way to understand that those inductive prerequisites for quantum mechanics and relativity is to understand all of the inductive prerequisites for the physics that comes before it. And this is why a full reproof is necessary. So of all of the physics is necessary. Once quantum mechanics and relativity can be put on a proper inductive foundation, we don't know what will happen. That will put the Inductive Physics Project and all of its participants in an unprecedented place, an unprecedented context of knowledge that might allow us to discover new principles of physics. So that is what we have in store in the future. And so today, let me tell you about hierarchy. This is an aspect of the theory of induction that I'm working on right now. So as Lee was saying, hierarchy is important for physics, for science, because it contextualizes our knowledge. But in order to understand that, especially as objectivists, we're going to have to make an additional differentiation that isn't covered in the objectivist literature. And this is specifically the difference between what I call logical inductive order and conditional hierarchy. And in the objectivist literature, these two separate things are generally both referred to by the term hierarchy of knowledge. Okay, now let me differentiate these two. First, let me talk about logical inductive order. Logical inductive order is the order of inductive dependence. It shows how some ideas rely for their inductive proof on other ideas. So here's a concrete example. So Newton couldn't have just looked up at the sky and looked at the planets and then looked at falling objects and then somehow figured out gravity. He couldn't have done that on its own. First, Copernicus had to identify that the planets are actually going around the sun and not the earth. And only then could Kepler understand that understand certain laws of motion about how those planets move. And only then could Newton look at additional observations, which he would then combine with those earlier ideas from Copernicus and Kepler to actually induce gravity. So induction is a process of using earlier ideas and new observations to come to further conclusions. Now, here's the important part. This is different from conditional hierarchy, which is another kind of hierarchy that is referred to as hierarchy of knowledge within the objectivist terminology, in objectivist circles and in much of the objectivist literature. So what's conditional hierarchy? This is a second kind of hierarchy. Two examples of a conditional hierarchy are the actual order of OPAR of Leonard Peikoff's book summarizing objectivism. So the actual order of OPAR is not in an inductive order, it's in the order of a conditional hierarchy. Euclid's Elements, which is that book the classic book on geometry where he's deducing everything from postulates, that is also a conditional hierarchy. And what a conditional hierarchy does, what's common about these two books, is it starts with the broadest principles, then shows how those broadest principles of whatever field it's in condition the narrower principles. and how those narrower principles condition or play a role in still narrower principles. So, for example, OPAR starts with the axioms, which of course apply to everything, and then and shows how the axioms apply to something a little more specific, like causality, which is the law of identity applied to action. Then causality plays a role in, for example, I'm skipping a lot of steps, but I'm skipping a lot of OPAR here, but it plays a role in the issue of rights. Why is it that man has rights? Well, it's because his mind is his basic means of survival. So the ideas which play a role in narrower ideas always come first in the OPAR hierarchy. This isn't, so now here's the deal. The inductive order and conditional hierarchy, the order of something like OPAR, these are different issues. So even though the axioms play a role in everything, you don't induce the axioms first. Ayn Rand induced things like rights and egoism earlier in her life than she identified the axioms. Now, she was implicitly using the axioms, of course, but her actual induction of rights and egoism and these more concrete things did not explicitly rely. That was not how she proved those concepts to herself inductively as she went. Now, this is important. This distinction is important for induction because these two hierarchies serve two separate roles, and we need to be clear on these separate roles. So first, the logical inductive order serves to actually prove the ideas. By actually going in inductive order, Newton was able to say, I know the planets go around the sun, thanks to Copernicus. I know they move in a particular way, thanks to Kepler. And now I've made some additional observations and some calculations, and combined with all that earlier knowledge, here's the proof that there's gravity. So the proof is inductive. On the other hand, the purpose of a conditional hierarchy is to integrate our knowledge, not to prove it, to integrate it. So, for example, the OPAR order is not an order of inductive dependence. It's not the proof of the principles. It gives some examples and justifications, of course, but that's not how you prove it. The proof is you getting the suggestion from OPAR and then comparing it to your own experience. It's an induction. And of course, the original induction was performed by Ayn Rand. So it's not a proof. So the purpose of the OPAR order is specifically to show how each fact applies to each other fact, as I said earlier. And the purpose of showing that is so that you can see the narrower facts in light of the broader facts which condition them. So for example, this is how we can understand the difference between, say, a libertarian like John Stossel. I'm using Stossel because he's actually like a good libertarian. I don't know what to make of the anarchists. So Stossel is someone who I regard as like, he's right as far as he goes. He just doesn't understand all of objectivism. So for example, he understands that free markets are more efficient than government controls. And he understands that people acting selfishly doesn't involve parasitism. However, an objectivist understands these principles of individual rights in an augmented sense, in a sense which is conditioned by all the stuff in OPAR, which comes before rights. So for example, we understand that rights are a result of the fact that our minds are our means of survival. So as a result, we don't get confused about animal rights. Whereas someone like Stossel he might say, well, yeah, it's messed up to torture animals and stuff like that. So does rights apply there? He may not be sure about that. Further, we know that the concept of rights is objective. It's a result of man's relationship to other men. It's not intrinsic. It's not like, something that's just, rights aren't something that are built into us. So as a result of this, we don't get confused about issues like abortion. We don't say, well, human beings just intrinsically have rights, and a fetus is a human being, so maybe killing it is basically murder. So someone like Stossel might get confused on some of that issue because he doesn't see the lower concept of rights in the light of the higher concepts, such as the objectivity of concepts and man's mind as his means of survival. So the conditional hierarchy serves this really important purpose. And of course, OPAR is, serves this purpose for understanding objectivism. Now, unfortunately, these two issues have been mixed together by objectivists and other thinkers in the past. So for objectivists, the two just simply haven't been sufficiently differentiated. Peikoff actually does make a distinction between these two hierarchies in his lecture, Objectivism Through Induction. But then sometimes he's inconsistent on this. So for example, in his lecture on induction in physics and philosophy, he refers to first level generalizations, specifically generalizations which come from sense data, the generalizations which are first in the inductive order. He refers to these as the axioms of induction, which shows an equivocation between the conditional order, where your axioms come first, and the inductive order, where your perceptual knowledge comes first. So there's at the very least with Peikoff and with in the other places in the objectivist literature, there's a lack of differentiation between these two issues. Now, in my view, clearing this up, differentiating these two issues from an objectivist context of knowledge is going to help us form a theory of induction. One other thing I'll say is the friend example from OPAR. In OPAR, Peikoff goes over the concept of friend and identifies its hierarchical roots. And in my video, in my video on two hierarchies, which we're discussing today, which I'm summarizing right now, I criticize that example. So that's something we can go over in the discussion. Now, in the case of non-objectivist thinkers, this issue has been a disaster. People have thought that conditional hierarchies, such as Euclid's Elements, where you start with like 5 assumptions and then deduce the rest of geometry from those 5 basic assumptions. People think that is the proof, when really it's the observations of geometry that constitute the proof. And what this does is it misses the fact that proof is inductive, not deductive. If proof was exclusively deductive, then you'd never be able to prove your starting point, since deduction always assumes something. So if proof was deductive, you could just simply never prove anything. And people like Ben Shapiro actually use this as a rationalization for their irrational beliefs. Ben Shapiro often says, well, you have to assume something. I just assume God, and you just assume, certain laws of physics or certain laws of logic, and you just start there and you make deductions, and you're just as proofless and irrational as I am. So long as this is your concept so long as deduction is our paradigm for how proof works, then we're just never going to understand the inductive nature of proof. And one way that this manifests is thinking that conditional hierarchies are proofs. So here's the deal. So if you're going top down, which is basically rationalism, you're never sure if what you started with is right. But here's the thing: the conditional hierarchy, going top down, serves a indispensable purpose, which is that if you're going bottom up, here's what ends up happening. And this has been an issue throughout the whole history of philosophy. This is the basis on which people like Descartes criticized Newton for reasoning from observation. There were actually people who didn't like the fact that Newton was being inductive. They thought rationalism was the way to go, and they were against Newton's inductive method. And here's the problem. It's a real problem. If you go bottom up, you aren't sure at any point whether you're accounting for the full set of facts which condition any particular case. So for example, Aristotle correctly observed that objects in motion tend to slow down. Now, of course, in a modern context, we know No, wait, objects in motion tend to stay in motion. That's like Newton's first law of physics. Here's the thing though. In a lot of cases that Aristotle observed, objects in motion do slow down. So how does that work? Well, of course it works because it's true that objects in motion tend to slow down, but that only happens when the cause of friction is present. So when we gather generalizations from observation, we have to identify the context in which those generalizations hold. And we can do that by arranging our statements in a conditional hierarchy. So here's a simple example of how that works. Euclid's elements the basic laws of geometry, are all deduced from 5 postulates. But here's the thing. Not all 5 of these postulates apply when you're on a curved surface. So for example, when you're doing geometry on the surface of the earth, when you're looking at maps, I mean, all geography basically takes place on a curved surface. So curved surfaces are actually really important. But here's the thing. 4 of Euclid's 5 postulates actually apply to curved surfaces. It's only the 5th postulate that doesn't apply. So what do? What you do is you just ask how many theorems can be deduced from just the 4 postulates. And it turns out that 28 of Euclid's many theorems actually can be deduced from just the first 4 postulates. And so you know that these 28 apply to curved surfaces, and then the rest don't apply to curved surfaces. Why? Well, because that 5th postulate, which is required for the deduction of the other ones, that 5th postulate doesn't apply on a curved surface. So as a result, everything that's deducible from that 5th postulate also doesn't apply to the curved surface. So by arranging everything in a conditional hierarchy, you're able to identify the context of application of each of your principles. Now it's very important. So like the main takeaway here is a conditional hierarchy does not prove our knowledge. It contextualizes it. Because conditional hierarchies show deductive structure. And of course, like proof is inductive, it's not deductive. So the proof is inductive. The proof is a series of observation and reasoning steps. But once you have this big body of knowledge, you integrate each bit of your knowledge and set it in its context by putting it in a conditional hierarchy. Qua integration, each fact is seen in the light of other facts which condition it. So in OPAR, rights is seen as being conditioned by egoism and man's mind as his means of survival. So when you condition that, you can actually understand what exactly rights are. You understand more about what they are. Qua contextualization, we see that for places, we identify that for places where egoism doesn't apply, then the concept, or rather, I'm sorry, for certain cases, because the purpose of rights is egoism, the purpose of rights is to live a happy life. There's certain cases where rights don't apply. So like Peikoff classically, there's this question someone asked him, what if you wash ashore on a deserted island and you're starving to death and there's this sign and there's these coconuts, but there's a sign that says private property, no eating my coconuts. Do you starve to death in order to respect this guy's rights? No, because the purpose of rights is for your own survival. And so there are times that because egoism conditions rights, we're able to see when rights apply and when they don't. So my theory of induction proves ideas by going in a logical inductive order, then contextualizes them by forming them into a conditional hierarchy. And so today's issue that we're going to try to go into a lot of details on is really differentiating these two different hierarchies. So I'll take it over to your questions.
Okay, Bob, you're up.
Would you call one of the hierarchies you're referring to epistemological and the other metaphysical?
Yes, that's a really good question. There's a little bit of a wrinkle here, but I'll start by agreeing. The conditional hierarchy is metaphysical. It identifies how some facts condition other facts, how they play a role in the identity of other facts. The inductive hierarchy is entirely epistemological. So, for example, if you had some aliens that didn't have eyesight, they didn't have the ability to detect light, their inductive hierarchy would look totally different from ours, because they would start with different percepts and they'd have to work their way to, say, like the idea of atoms through some completely different inductive route than we did. Whereas the conditional hierarchy just identifies which facts play a role in which other facts. So that's a metaphysical issue. However, here's the thing. I'm actually going to stop there because the wrinkle may not be that important. We can get to that if we need to.
Another clarification again. What are these points on the hierarchy? Are they concepts, principles, propositions, lies?
There is actually something I'm working on, which I call a hierarchy of rationalization. I think basically when you lie, you have to tell another lie, which conditions that lie. So you actually go up the hierarchy in a sort of evil way. And I'm toying with the idea that this is how you can understand philosophers like Kant. Is that, or how you go from understanding someone like, I don't know, like someone like Heraclitus, and then understand the evolution from someone like Heraclitus all the way to Kant, is like through a process of rationalization. But anyway, yeah. So we don't include lies. We include only truths in our conditional hierarchy. And specifically, we talk about propositions, how some propositions, because concepts on their own don't identify facts. They are the vocabulary of identifying facts. So only propositions identify facts. So it's how some facts condition others. So it's the units or propositions related to one another.
Now, given any 2 points on your hierarchy, are they in opposite directions? They're always, you'll never get 1 point that is the opposite direction of, let's see, supposing A is logically prior to B. Is it always the case that B must be a fact in order for A to hold?
Tell me if this is what you're asking. Are you asking, is the conditional hierarchy always the reverse of the inductive hierarchy?
Yes, but I wanted to conclude that from the answer to this question.
Right. So the answer is many times, often, the conditional hierarchy is the reverse of the inductive hierarchy, simply because when we look in front of us, we don't see general facts, we see specific facts. And then the only reason we even need to identify general facts is so that we can predict and control new instances when we come across them.
Okay, so unless all is not an operative word here, then there's only one hierarchy. You just look at it from one direction or the other direction.
Well, it's not all, because sometimes, so I'll give an example. It's not always in reverse. So Newton induced his 3 laws of motion. Then once he had those laws in motion in hand, what he then did is he did some deductions from those laws of motion. And he actually predicted that the Earth would be not a sphere, but kind of a smushed sphere, because it's spinning, and that kind of makes it bulge out at the sides, kind of like if you spin your arms will do this. So it's that's happening with the Earth basically. And he deduced exactly the shape the Earth should have based on how fast it's spinning. Later, and so what you could say is he induced a more specific law, the fact that spinning objects bulge at their center. He induced that generalization by deduction from a higher principle. So the inductive order doesn't always go from the narrower to the broader. Sometimes the inductive order proceeds by deduction, going from the broader to the narrower.
I have to contemplate that a little bit.
Yeah. Because that sounds like
this is part of what
on the face of it.
This is part of
because you're saying the inductive order is not the inductive order, it's partly deductive order, which I think is right, because I think what you're really talking about. I'm interrupting Bob here just for a second.
No, that's fine.
I think what you're calling the inductive order is actually what you really mean is the order of proof, and you think proof is inductive, except that sometimes it is deductive. Sometimes it's deductive. So, for example, just take your Euclid case. I think it was wrong for you. Well, maybe I don't remember exactly what you said, but I took you to say that Euclid's geometry is not proved deductively, and I would say no, that's not correct. It is proved deductively along with inductive proof. There's inductive proof of the axioms, and then the theorems that follow are proved deductively. So it is a combination of the two. So a hierarchy of proof is not purely inductive, I guess, is my conclusion there.
I would not say it that way. This is a really important issue to clear. So I'm glad we touched on this. So the way I would say it is this: induction and deduction are not opposites in every respect. They are opposites in only one respect, in that deduction goes from general to specific, whereas induction goes from observation to general. And so in sort of this one sense, they're opposites. But during the process of induction, you often must make deductions as part of that process. So for example,
but nobody's saying they're opposite. I mean, that wasn't the point. The point is that they're different.
I'm questioning.
The process is different. Maybe Bob is. The process is different. It's not that they're opposite. Yeah. It's that there's a different process, and that they're both involved in proof. I'll stop. Back to Bob. Sorry, Bob.
Well, I think of the inductive as being logically necessary, chronologically necessary. But deductive is also a version of proof, but it's a version of proof, as you point out, given some other things, then you can deduce these things. And now a final hierarchy at any two arbitrary points, any two arbitrary truths, in some way it's all the same hierarchy, but it's just that you have to traverse it up and down in certain ways. Sometimes you can't go up until you've gone down on some details.
So
go ahead.
I have a specific example, I think, that'll address two of your points. First, that your first point is you're returning to the point, which is correct, that deduction in a sense can prove something. So like that's correct, but I have a certain view on that. The other idea is it's all the same hierarchy. It's just that you're either going up it or down it. So I'll use Euclid's Elements as an example. On one hand, I would say you can't just deduce from the axioms and say that you can't just deduce from Euclid's 5 postulates and say that you've proven the theorems. You can't do that, because how do you know the postulates are true? Yep. But then you could say, well, you just look at reality and you see that in certain contexts, those 5 postulates are true. And so there, it's inductive. You've identified, you've proven the first 5 by seeing them. Then you made some deductions and proved the rest. So a deductive proof is perfectly fine. Now, I'd say 2 things. First of all, this is an inductive proof because it really does rely on observation. It's just an induction and then a bunch of deductions. But here's something else I'll say. The first 5 postulates of Euclid are not, they can be identified by observation, but if you started geometry, you'd never think to identify those 5 as being essential. I'm going to screen share real quick so that the audience can see what the hell I'm talking about when I say, how do I screen share? Oh, there's literally a button right there. Let's see. Let me show you what Euclid's 5 postulates are. Oops. Oh, I only have a picture of Euclid's 4 postulates, which is really.
Well, we don't want to get into. We don't want to get too far into the weeds of the postulates.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, there are particular. Yeah. We're not going to do that. So, like, basically, there are these 5.
Yeah, that those things are arrived at either by direct perception or by inductive reasoning from direct perception. But then you can prove, once you've arrived at that, you can then prove things by deduction. Okay.
So here's
Can I jump in about the
So I'll finish my earlier point by simply saying you can't actually start inductively with Euclid's 5 postulates. You'd never think to single out those particular 5 things. If you go in an actual order of induction, then geometry has a very different order than the elements. You're going to notice things like certain facts about triangles first is the order that I actually go in. Then eventually you'll accumulate this giant pile of geometric generalizations, and then you will systematize them as Euclid did. So that you can identify which one will apply in any particular case.
Yeah. I have something to say about that point after Bob if he's got some more stuff on.
Well, two other things.
Good.
That were in my mind a second ago.
I know how that is.
One is that history is a good clue to the inductive order. So,
say that once more, Bob. Sorry. Once more.
History is a good clue to the inductive order.
Okay.
The other, one more observation before I get to the second observation. In other words, I've got 3. That the spiral theory of knowledge follows from what we can say here.
You just scooped me, Bob. You scooped me. Okay. I should have jumped in. All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, the other point is about if you try to mash the 2 hierarchies as being identical, the way you can do that is by taking any of the metaphysical prior things as being known implicitly.
Right. That's right.
In other words, nobody really knows anything implicitly, as James points out in his lecture, that you can't form an induction based on something you know implicitly, because you don't know it implicitly. To know it implicitly is not to know it. And yet implicit knowledge has a meaning to us. We know what we're talking about. So what is it that we're talking about? I have an idea. I'd like to hear you, James.
Oh yeah, so this is an important issue. So a lot of part of the basis on which the OPAR order is referred to as an inductive order is that it's an implicit order of learning. And the reason for this is that when a kid opens his eyes and identifies just things in front of him, he's identifying an instance of the law of identity, and he's treating it as though the law of identity is true. He's making identifications about it. He doesn't have words, but he sees that it's long. He sees that it's round. He's committing this to memory, and in so doing, he is relying upon the fact that things are what they are. Or actually, no, that's totally not the right way to say it. He is acting as though things are what they are. So we say that he knows it implicitly. But as you're saying, and that's a good way to put it, to know it implicitly is to know it implicitly. He cannot reason from this implicit knowledge. He can reason from only, oh, this is long, this is round, and then he can go from there and maybe discover whatever that empowers him to discover next. Now, so let's see. So you can't reason from implicit knowledge. And part of the basis of calling the OPAR order an inductive order is that it is an implicit order of learning. That's something that Peikoff talks about in Objectivism State of the Art. He says that he is writing OPAR. He gives this lecture as he's writing OPAR. He says, I'm ordering the book according to an implicit order of learning. And he does identify an implicit order of learning. It's a plausible order in which someone gathers these things implicitly. But the implicit knowledge at each stage is not used to gain the implicit knowledge at the next stage. Like when you're using knowledge of this pen to then identify whatever other knowledge comes later. You're using knowledge of like the fact that things fall, for example, to play baseball later in life. You're doing things like this. You're not using identity to then, you're not using the law of identity to then identify something else. Now you're acting as though the law of identity is true, and you're acting as though the law of causality is true. But you're not using knowledge of those things in order, those higher level principles in order to make the next step. You're using knowledge of the specifics because you're explicitly aware of the specifics. So that's how the issue of implicit knowledge comes in. And an equivocation on what implicit knowledge really means, I think, is part of what makes this part of what makes it easy to mix these two hierarchies together.
Okay, I think this is a good spot, unless Bob's still in charge as far as I'm concerned, but if I can jump in here, if that's all right, I will, because I think this is a good point.
Let me get this super chat out of the way. But Bonnie Bertrand asked,
Yeah.
how is conditional hierarchy a form of rationalism? And thank you for that super chat, Bonnie.
How is it or is it? Is she asking or is she telling us it is?
No, it's a question. How is it? There's no it. It just says, how is conditional hierarchy?
I don't know if James actually said that.
No, I don't think so. I think she's just asking a general.
Well, I can clarify something.
Go ahead. Do it.
So a conditional hierarchy is not a form of rationalism. It's an absolutely critical aspect of correct thinking. So for example, OPAR is a conditional hierarchy. Euclid's Elements is a conditional hierarchy. And these are both valid bodies of knowledge. But if you think that a conditional hierarchy constitutes the proof of an idea, then that's rationalism. That's the thing that's rational. So there's nothing wrong with conditional hierarchy as long as you're clear on what it performs. A conditional hierarchy integrates and contextualizes our knowledge. It does not prove it.
Okay, I usually like to try to simplify things if I can. I like simplification, but I'm going to try to simplify this time by first complicating things and see if that works. I don't know. But here's the thing that
shot.
struck me about this. First of all, I wrote down the word and circled it, spiraling, but Bob beat me to that. So anyway, we know what spiraling is. But let's look at it more carefully. We don't want to speak. We don't want to talk as if the concepts we're talking about here that are arranged hierarchically or the propositions or whatever they are. Let me use concepts. Are hard little forms. They're immutable forms that are changeless and are the way they are all the time. And that seems to be a lot of the talk here seems to be in that vein. What I would point out there is that as a human being develops, there are all kinds of different concepts, different levels of knowledge about the concept, often different definitions. As Ayn Rand points out, a young child will define gold as a yellow metal, but then when you get out there and you're prospecting and you pick up yellow metals, you're going to pick up a lot of fool's gold, and that won't work. You got to have a better definition. So definitions change, your knowledge of a concept changes, and that I think has a whole lot of implication for hierarchy.
Yes.
And by the way, not only do the concepts change, I think spiraling occurs between concepts. As one concept changes, it changes another one, and that back reacts on the first one. So that can happen. And that may be, the infamous example that McCaskey talked about of Galileo and inertia might come into play here. Galileo did, if I understand the situation, did not have a proper concept of inertia, but he knew something. And whether you call it, I don't care whether you call it implicit or explicit or well-defined or poorly defined or a red light or a green light or a purple light or a yellow, I don't care what you call it, he was able to use that to do some reasoning. And then you get to Newton, and Newton gets a more precise concept, and he's able to go further than that. So I think that complicates all of these hierarchy things considerably, because what Dr. Peikoff is talking about sometimes in OPAR, and I have to go back and reread the whole thing to be really clear about this, but sometimes he's talking about a hierarchy after you've been through a whole lot of spiraling and you're a philosopher and you got that. And you have to distinguish that hierarchy from a young child or even an unsophisticated, the plain man in the street, as the philosophers say. So you have to distinguish those things. And I guess, I got to throw in one more. I could go further, but I'm going to turn it back to you, James. But I want to throw in one more thing, which I've said to you before. I hate that word condition. I just hate it. Not just because, not only because it's behaviorism. It reminds me of behaviorism. Conditioning. That's the minor reason. The major reason is it's so vague, plays a role in it. I don't like that. I would if you could shape that up and sharpen it, I would be much obliged. And I can figure out what's going on better, much better. Anyway, so I just had to bring that up again. So let me turn it back.
Yeah, that's an important thing to bring up. So I'll address why I use such a strange word.
That's right. Let me mention one other quick thing, just because this is just at concretization. Bob and I had an interesting discussion on Cutting Edge some time ago about rights and government and what's the proper hierarchy of rights and government. Now, from the start, I thought the answer was completely obvious. I still think it's pretty obvious. I thought it's obvious that rights come first, then comes government. And I had a simple argument, and I think it was an airtight argument. But you do have to consider this issue I just mentioned of it's not like we have a Platonic form of government a Platonic form of rights that came down on us before the concept of the Platonic form of government fell down on us. We had some concept of right. I still think rights come first, and Bob still disagrees with me, but that's okay. We had some primitive form of rights first, and then some primitive form of government, and then it spiraled around till we got to our current. That's a good, good concretization of what I'm getting. So I'll stop there.
So I'll cover all three. So first, let's see. Okay, the first thing you brought, these are three massive issues. So my crow blew, but
only have like
7
minutes.
So. Let me remind, what was the first issue again?
The first issue? Well, I said it was really the spiraling, that there are various levels of knowledge and
right.
definition.
Okay, yeah.
And concepts are not hard little Platonic forms.
So concept, like, so the first one was regarding the spiral theory of knowledge, which is that as you accumulate more knowledge, you properly change your definitions and conceptualizations. So how does that work? Well, here's the deal. Basically what I'm doing here in saying all of this is I'm describing in detail how the spiral theory of knowledge works. Peikoff gives some general characteristics of the spiral theory of knowledge. What I'm doing is I'm giving the specifics, and I think I can make this. And this, I think, and you said some. You complicated it as you said you would, and now I think I can tie that into a nice bow. I think. Let's give it a shot. So, you're young. You'll learn some stuff about plants, let's say, okay? You learn some stuff about living things, okay? So you see, and you notice some living things move and some of them don't move. They're both living things, but some of them move and some of them don't move. I'm gonna call those, the ones that move, animals. I'm gonna call the ones that don't move, I'm gonna call those plants, okay? So you come across a mushroom, and you say, oh, hey, another plant. That's a wacky looking plant. And a biologist says, you idiot, that's not a plant. Now, so from the kid's context of knowledge, that's totally wrong to say. The kid doesn't from the biologist's context of knowledge, it is right to say that they've made a mistake. But they need to understand that the child doesn't understand the facts which require a differentiation between mushrooms and other plants. It turns out that, mushrooms don't do photosynthesis and they don't technically have roots. They have these, I forget what they're called, these stringy things that go out and eat dead stuff in the, something like that. So they're not roots, they're something else, flagellum, cilia, something like that, some stringy things. So, they're very much different, but from the child's context of knowledge, he's only aware of one differentiation here. Some of the living things move, some of them don't. So what the hell are you telling me a mushroom?
Can I stop you just for a second, James, on this example?
Yeah.
On this example?
Yeah.
It's not clear to me why you say the biologist would say the child is wrong. Because the biologist would say, I don't know if there's a technical definition for plant. There are various kingdoms of various kingdoms. And there's a kingdom that includes the fungi, and there's a kingdom that includes we call plants. But I don't think you would object to the child saying that's a plant at the level of that's something that is planted. It doesn't move around. It's differentiated. That differentiation is not against biology or anything. It's just that there are further differentiations in science that differentiate that broad category into a number of other categories, or some number.
Yeah.
There's bacteria also.
I think that's
there's
right.
There's several categories, and well, I know. Let's not get technical. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's an error. This is necessarily an error. Even to a biologist, I don't see why that's an error. It's just it's not a complete.
Well, the biologist would be wrong. The biologist would be wrong to say that the child is wrong. The child is right within his context of knowledge.
I would say that's true with the gold example too. The accomplished gold prospector would be wrong saying the child's definition of gold is wrong, but somehow I see that as different because there the definition changed. It's not merely a differentiate. Maybe this isn't too important for our purposes, but it's not merely a differentiation.
No, it is.
The change in definition. So it's not just that the category became more differentiated, which I see as the case. It looks to me as the case with plants. It looks like there's a redefinition, and some things that were in the category are now out of the category as a result, like that. Yeah, it's like that. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
So now the way we can understand this change of definitions and this spiraling, the way we can understand this inductively is to talk about both inductive order and conditional hierarchy. So qua inductive order, the child grows up, he starts learning facts about biology. If he didn't go to a progressive school, he starts learning facts about biology. And then he realizes, one fact about living things, which conditions a great many other facts of those living things, is how they get their nutrients. And I can see that some plants do photosynthesis, and other plants, forgive me biologists, but other plants like fungi eat dead stuff in their surroundings with these stringy things. I forget, something like that. So I didn't go to a progressive school, so I actually remember that much from my 7th grade biology class. So he understands that, and he understands that qua his inductive journey. Then qua conditioning hierarchy, he sees that because the nutrient gathering mechanism conditions a great many other facts about the way organisms are, he decides, man, I got to stop calling those plants. That needs a whole different category than other plants, the plants that do photosynthesis. I need to choose a different standard of differentiation, because the standard of differentiation of locomotion versus non-locomotion, that doesn't capture essentials. It doesn't capture a large number of other conditioning factors. So instead, I need to talk about whether they use photosynthesis or whether they use the feeding with the stringy, the fungi method of feeding.
Yeah,
I need to differentiate based on that.
Feeding on decomposing, other decomposing, formerly animate matter, whatever you call that, decomposed material. Yeah. I guess we're headed. We ought to be heading pretty soon here.
Wait, we got another super chat from Joey. From Joey, who we met at the conference. Joey Queso. Yeah. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. He says Rand's understanding versus grasp may help in this. Let me read it again. Rand's
versus Greg's.
No, this is Joey Casso's super chat.
Okay.
Sorry.
What does he say?
It's a comment because there's no question mark.
Okay.
So the concepts understand. Yeah, the concepts understanding and grasp.
Understanding versus grasp. So that
yes,
I'm not sure. I kind of get what he's getting at there, but I'm not sure whether the distinction is always the same distinction. As a grasp, understanding would seem to imply something conceptual, and a grasp might not. And that you might grasp something without having a full understanding. And I think we could agree. I think we'd agree with that. If that's what he's getting at, I think that would be agreeable. Bob looks like he wants to.
Well, if grasp is taken, I can differentiate this from that. And understanding says, understanding is something that clearly grows by time. You understand more and more. So
that's true. So that may be helpful again in the understanding what goes on in the spiraling process. Is that if you start with the grasp and proceed to an understanding and proceed from there to a deeper understanding, that may be of some value. By the way, I should mention before I forget, we've just gotten to this issue of hierarchy. I'm not sure we've disposed of it by any means, but anyway, that means we have to go on next time. James, you're going to have to come back in a couple of weeks to do the next, to actually talk about induction per se, and maybe we can say a few more things about hierarchy, because I don't think we've wrapped that up. But we can't wrap it up now, but we can. But thank everybody for coming, and we can all go over to Clubhouse. We can do that. Are we ready?
Sounds good.
Joey, join us on Clubhouse.
Yeah. You're going to go over there, aren't you, James?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go over to Clubhouse, and we'll let if the people want to, we'll let James hold forth on people's questions first, and then take it from there. Okay.
Thanks
a lot.
Me. See you all on Clubhouse.
We'll see you next time.